Thank you very much, Sarah and Alejandra. So now I'm going to introduce today's speaker, and it's an honor to introduce, I guess, reintroduce Nathaniel Stinnett, who was here 4 years ago. Nathaniel is a former attorney and the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, which is a non-partisan NGO that uses data analytics and behavioral science to mobilize environmentalists to go out and vote. His work at EVP has received a lot of national attention. For example, after the last election, he was named one of 5 global climate visionaries by the New York Times, and his cutting-edge work has earned him the nickname of the voting guru by Grist magazine. Before the Environmental Voter Project, Nathaniel had a number of senior leadership and campaign manager positions on congressional, state, and mayoral campaigns. And he's also currently on the board of advisors for MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. So after his talk today, I think you will be convinced why, as environmentalists, we should be civically and politically engaged. And if you haven't done so yet, I hope his talk and the information that Jambo both gave you inspires you to register to vote. So with that, Nathaniel, thank you for being here today, and we're so happy to have you back.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Sarah and Alejandra, for all the work that Jumbo Votes is doing. It is crucially important. And I realize that, like, everything you're used to doing is now a little bit harder when everything is virtual. And so just really thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And thank you for everybody else who's taking time out of their day to hear a little bit about our work at the Environmental Voter Project and some of the cutting edge tools that we're seeing in the environmental movement and the political space right now. I am going to start just by sharing my screen here for a second. Give me a second here. All right, so as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to give a presentation and then we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A folder or just save them for the end and we'll get to them. And hopefully we'll have a really nice Q&A and discussion. So very simply, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that just does 2 things. We identify environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. And so what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that your typical nonprofit normally does do. For instance, we don't lobby for particular policies. We don't endorse candidates. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment, as odd as that might sound. A good way to think of us is we're not in the mind-changing business or the opinion-changing business. Instead, we're in the behavior-changing business. What we try to do is we find the people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They're already with us. They're dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists, but they're not voting. They need a behavioral intervention. And that's where we step in and try to turn them into better voters. And the way this presentation is going to go is I'm going to tell you a lot about our work, but my hope is while telling you about the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project, you'll learn a few important things. One, why it's so important for the environmental movement to vote. It might sound obvious, but we actually have so much more potential political power than we currently realize at the moment. 2, I'm going to get into some of the cutting edge data and behavioral tools that very sophisticated campaigns and nonprofits are now using. And then 3, I'll go into just some of the results that we're getting just so you can get an idea of how powerful these behavioral science techniques and data techniques are. And then hopefully we'll have a great conversation about it. So, to start, why do we do what we do? Well, one of the biggest reasons, if not the biggest reason, we can't get progressive environmental leadership in the United States, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, is actually really simple. There aren't enough voters who care deeply about environmental issues. Let's start by going back in time 4 years ago to the 2016 presidential election. I know it's something that many of us might rather forget, but I think it's instructive. Heading into the 2016 presidential election, only 2% of likely voters listed climate or the environment as their #1 priority. That's it. And another 2% listed it as their second highest priority. Maybe many of you, like I, were deeply frustrated that there wasn't a single question about climate change in any of those presidential debates. Well, this is why. This is why. When voters don't care deeply about something, boy, is it hard to get politicians to care about that issue. Moreover, it's pretty darn hard to get the media and debate moderators to care about this issue. And heading into the presidential election, only 2% of likely voters listed it as their top priority and another 2% as their second highest priority. And that lack of voter demand has enormous impacts, enormous impacts. Now, the good news, as I'm sure many of you are aware, these numbers have gone up since 4 years ago, which is great. If we fast forward 2 years to the 2018 midterms, 7% of voters, and now we're looking at exit polling data, listed climate or the environment as their top priority. Now, to be clear, this is an apples to oranges comparison, because obviously a midterm electorate is different in size and different in the types of voters that show up than a presidential electorate. So it really is an apples to oranges comparison. But still, even with that caveat, by any objective measure, a 2% to 7% jump of people listing climate or the environment as their top priority is a pretty big deal. And I'd suggest to you, it's no surprise that coming out of the 2018 election, you start seeing a lot of grassroots climate and environmental groups starting to really get a lot more power, groups like the Sunrise Movement. You start seeing Democrats who are running for president not just talk about climate or the environment, which sure as heck didn't happen in 2015 and 16, but even some of them, like Jay Inslee or Tom Steyer, made climate the sole focus, like the main focus of their campaigns. And then other people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and even Michael Bloomberg sure as heck spent a lot of time talking about it. And obviously part of that is just a genuine interest and concern on their part. But another part was they're going where the votes are. Take it from someone who's run dozens of campaigns. If you're running for office, your goal is to win. And you're not going to spend all your time and effort talking about an issue if voters don't care about it. And what we started to see in 2019 as these numbers ticked up is that more and more politicians running for office started focusing on this. By the beginning of 2020, before coronavirus hit, 12% of likely voters in the upcoming presidential election listed climate or the environment as their top priority. So we went from 2% in 2016 to 12% in 2020. Now, since COVID hit, obviously priorities have changed a bit. Some polls have 8 or 9% of likely voters listing it as their top priority. Some still have it up closer to 12. It's probably taken a little bit of a dip. But what I want to suggest to you is that although it's great that these numbers have gone up, boy, can we not be patting ourselves on the back. Not when there are issues like healthcare or immigration or coronavirus, which obviously we all hope will go away soon, or the economy and jobs, that have twice or 3 times as many voters listing it as their top priority. If we're not going to get up as a top tier issue, as a top concern, then not only is that going to impact the types of people we elect, but much more importantly, it's going to impact the policy that is made. Because no matter whom we elect, they still need to decide what to spend their political capital on. Even when we elect the so-called right people, it isn't like they can snap their fingers and just get whatever they want. They still need to be parsimonious with what they go all out on, what limbs they crawl out on. And boy, are they not going to spend all their political capital on something that like 9% of voters list as a top priority. They're just not. And so this lack of voter demand is a significant issue. And the reason it's so significant is this. And if there is only one thing that you take away from this presentation today, let it be what I'm about to say, because it is crucially, crucially important. Who you vote for is secret. I think everybody grows up knowing that in the United States. Who you vote for is secret. But what many people don't realize is that whether you vote or not is public record. It is public record what elections you vote in and what elections you don't vote in. And not only is it public record, it is quite literally the essential building block for how all campaigns are run and how all policy is made. So let me give you an example. Let me take you into the first meeting that any campaign has, whether you're running for president or governor or city council. Okay, let's say that Sarah is running for governor of Massachusetts. Congratulations, Sarah. And the Sarah Gomez for Massachusetts campaign, for better or for worse, has hired me to be their campaign manager. Okay, this is the discussion that Sarah and I have and everybody else on staff has. We sit down and the first thing we do is we open up our laptops and we look at public voter files. Remember what I just said to you. Whether you vote or not and which elections you vote in is public record. So Sarah and I and everybody else on staff look at public voter files and we see everybody in Massachusetts by name and street address and what elections they vote in and what elections they don't. Huh, and over here is a group of people who aren't registered. Do you think with limited time and money, the Gomez for Massachusetts campaign is going to talk to all these unregistered voters? No way. Oh, here are some people who are registered, but they've never actually shown up and cast a ballot. Well, we're not going to talk to them either. Oh, here's a group that's registered, and they do vote, but only in presidential elections, and gubernatorials are on a midterm cycle. So not unless we're literally like bathing in macash are we going to actually spend time and money talking to those people either. Oh, over here are people who are registered and they vote in midterms and gubernatorials. Yeah, we'll talk to them. Oh, and over here are people who even vote in municipal elections. We'll talk to them too. This is how every campaign runs. Because you have limited time and limited money, and your only goal is to get the most votes on a Tuesday in November. And you literally know by name and street address who has a history of turning up in this election you want to win and who doesn't. And unless you are just bathing in money, you're not going to talk to the people who don't have a history of showing up in your election. And what's more, if your campaign is only going to target those likely voters, who do you think they're going to poll? That's right, they're only going to poll the people who have public voting histories of showing up in these elections. And so what this means, and again, this is so crucially important to understand for anybody who has a passing interest in policymaking and government and environmental issues and politics. Politicians and policymakers know who votes and who doesn't vote. And they only poll the good voters. They only care about the priorities and the policy preferences of voters. And they don't care about the opinions of non-voters. And believe me, I hear the words coming out of my mouth. Like, I know how cynical this sounds, but let's be honest with ourselves. This is something we accept in every other aspect of our lives, right? Like, you go to Starbucks and you don't expect them to care about the opinions of non-coffee drinkers, right? Like, Starbucks cares about people who drink coffee. That's their market. Well, same thing with politicians. Why on earth would politicians care about the opinions of people who never actually show up to the elections that decide who the politicians are? Let's take Ford Motor Company. Like, would Ford Motor Company put together a huge multi-million-dollar ad campaign targeting 3-year-olds? No, 3-year-olds don't drive. 3-year-olds don't buy cars. The same thing with politicians. Politicians don't care about the opinions and policy priorities of non-voters. And they literally know who votes and who doesn't vote by name and street address. It's public record. And that is, again, I just want to say, if there's one thing you take away from this presentation, let it be that. Because a lot of people don't realize how crucially important that one piece of information is to how all policy is made and how all campaigns are run. And so why is this important for the environmental movement? Well, because of those two previous slides that I just showed to you. It's the easiest thing in the world for politicians to poll voters, not non-voters, but voters. And when they do that, regardless of what election you're looking at, whether it be local, state, or federal, there are so few actual voters listing climate or the environment as their top priority. And that's a real problem. It's a real problem. Now, this gets to the reason why I founded the Environmental Voter Project almost 4 years ago, or 4 years ago. Because this was something that deeply frustrated me while I was running political campaigns. I always realized, like, gosh, like, none of these people who are going to decide the election care about this issue. Like, it would be malpractice to spend all our time talking about an issue that voters don't want to hear about. And I started to realize the reason so few voters care deeply about climate and the environment is for a really odd reason. It turns out that there are tens of millions of Americans who actually do list climate or the environment as their top priority. So if there are that many Americans who list it as a top priority, how come they're not showing up in polls of likely voters? And as I started digging through voter file data and lots of different polling data, we came to realize that it's for one pretty simple, obvious reason. Environmentalists are awful voters. What we came to realize is that the environmental movement and the climate movement does not have a persuasion problem. We have a turnout problem. We've actually done a pretty darn good job of getting tens of millions of people to care so much about climate or the environment that it's their #1 priority over all other issues. They're just not showing up to vote. As you can see here, 10.1 million already registered voters who list climate or the environment as their top priority sat out the 2016 presidential election, an election that was decided by 77,000 votes in 3 states. This is an enormous opportunity for us. This is a huge pool of latent political power. And this gets to what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. We live in a moment in time where it's almost impossible to change people's minds, especially about climate change. But what we've realized is there are all of these people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They're already with us. They just need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. It's not. But it's a heck of a lot easier than changing people's minds. And so that's what we do. We are like the nerds of the environmental movement. We're really just data scientists and behavioral scientists that go and try to isolate who all the non-voting environmentalists are, and then make these behavioral interventions to try to change their behavior, just like you're trying to get someone to eat healthier or exercise more often. But we're trying to change their voting habits because we've realized that we're sitting on this enormous amount of unused political power. And if we can even vote as much as the average American does, no one's going to be able to stop the climate movement. No one. So I'm going to get into how we do this because you'll learn a little bit about us, but also a little bit about how modern political campaigns leverage cutting-edge data and behavioral techniques to get people to vote. But before I do that, I just want to spend one more slide talking about the scope of this turnout problem in the environmental movement, because I think it's really important to understand. If we go back to the 2014 midterms, 44% of registered voters voted, but only 21% of environmentalists did. A huge, huge gap. 2016 presidential election, 69% of registered voters voted, only 50% of environmentalists did. 2018, the last midterm, I think everybody is aware of the fact that it was a blue wave election, very high progressive turnout. It was also a high turnout overall. It was the highest midterm turnout rate going all the way back to 1914. And believe me, people were pretty engaged in November of 1914. It was a few months after the so-called war to end all wars broke out. That was the last time we had those high turnout rates. Environmentalists did a lot better, 53%. But what I want to suggest to you is, again, we can't pat ourselves on the back for this. We shouldn't be excited about almost barely just clawing our way to average. Believe me, when you look at other issue constituency groups, let's take the NRA, for example. If you care deeply about gun rights right now in the United States of America, believe me, you're not trying to get to 57%. Your only question is, are you going to turn out at 85 or 90%? If you're an NRA member, you vote like it's your job. You vote in library trustee elections and dog catcher elections like you never miss an election. That's where the environmental movement needs to be. And if we get up to that point, I mean, we'll have 4 or 5 times as many voters as the NRA does. We will be unstoppable. So how do we do this? And I want you to forgive me if I breeze through a little bit of this, because I don't want to presume to know the aspect of our work that you care most about. That's what the Q&A is for. And I do want to make sure to leave time for at least 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. We essentially take a 3-step process. 1, identification. We use data analytics and predictive modeling, and I'm going to describe to you what I mean by that in a bit, to individually identify people who list climate or the environment as their #1 priority yet don't vote. And what that then enables us to do is bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics, which is changing people's minds. If we can isolate the people who care so much about climate, like you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change, well then we can just go right to the behavioral intervention. And that gets to the second part here, mobilization. We run hundreds of randomized control trials, isolating which behavioral science techniques, which messages work best at which subgroups of non-voting environmentalists to just turn them into better voters. That's all we care about. Hell, we could talk about chocolate chip cookies if it was the best way to get these people to vote. Oftentimes, we never even talk about the environment because we know they're with us already. We just need to turn them into better voters. And then the third thing is habit reinforcement. Surprise, surprise, when you're trying to change someone's behavior, you can't just talk to them every 2 or 4 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. It just doesn't work. Like, that's not how you get someone to exercise more often, is like make sure they show up in the gym every 2 years. That's not how you change someone's eating habits. And it's also not how you get someone to become a more consistent voter. And so we go into states where there are lots of these non-voting environmentalists, and we're very serious about using every election, no matter how small, local, state, federal, primary, general, special, every election is an important behavioral intervention opportunity to change these people's voting habits. So very quickly, how do we do this? And again, forgive me if I breeze over some of this. There's a reason we have the Q&A, and I don't want to presume the aspect of our work that you care most about. That's what the Q&A is for. So the first step, data analytics and predictive modeling. This is so important to understand because we're living through campaigns using this right now. The Biden campaign, the Trump campaign, all of the sophisticated US Senate and gubernatorial campaigns, they're not targeting people by demographic group. What they're doing is using data analytics and predictive modeling to individually identify people on voter files and assign scores to them saying, oh, let's go after Sarah Gomez. She has a 92% likelihood of being X or being Y or being Z or thinking A or B or C. It's an individualized targeting process. And this is how it works. And I'll give you the example in our work at the Environmental Voter Project. But again, I want to be clear, this targeting process is what campaigns also use. It starts by us doing enormous polls. Your typical political poll would have maybe, poll 600 or 800 people or maybe 1,000 people. We will poll 15,000 or 20,000 people in one state. Huge, huge polls. But we can get away with it. It's not prohibitively expensive because we're only asking one question. We're simply asking, what's your #1 most important political priority? And when we get 20,000 of these responses, it's then really easy to work with data scientists to look at the people who listed climate or some other environmental issue as their top priority. And let's say we've got 3,000 or 4,000 of them. And we can start saying, okay, What do we know about these people? What kind of data points do we have about them on voter files? What do we have from the census? What do we have from publicly available consumer and behavioral data? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of data out there. And they can start looking for hidden patterns and correlations. They can start seeing things like, if we look at all these people, it looks like forestry employees are 11 times more likely than the average respondent to list climate or the environment as their top priority. And Latinos and Latinas are 7 times more likely. Oh, and if you're a basketball fan, you're more likely than a football, hockey, or baseball fan. Oh, and if you've just bought a new home and have new kids, they find all these predictive data points. Now, I want to be clear, these data points vary from state to state. No single data point is ever terribly helpful on its own. But when you combine a whole bunch of them, that's when the real magic starts to happen. That's when these data scientists can say, wow, looking at this stuff. Man, if you're an aging hippie who lives in the Berkshires and bought a Volvo between 8 and 10 years ago and subscribes to National Geographic and shops at the Gap, holy moly, like you've got a 91% likelihood of listing climate or the environment as your top priority. Wow. And they can find these little profiles. And then what they do is they build a predictive model, which is kind of like what it sounds like. It's a model of not just those 20,000 survey respondents, but of the entire state that helps us predict how likely every single person in the state is to list climate or the environment as their #1 priority. So they're extrapolating from the findings of these 20,000 people to build a model that helps them find all the other super environmentalists in a state. And what we do is we literally assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single person in a state voter file. And what you're looking at here is a distribution curve of every single voter in the state of Florida. Every single one of them. And you'll see the average Floridian only has like a 12% likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. But there are literally millions of Floridians who are 3 or 4 or even 5 times as likely as the average Floridian to not just care about climate or the environment, but list it as their absolute #1 priority. And these are individualized scores, not large demographic groups, individualized scores. Every single voter has one of these scores. And we test and we retest and refine, and then we ship out our list of super environmentalists to an outside polling shop and have them check our work. And it's frighteningly accurate. Frighteningly accurate. And this is how campaigns target people now. They don't target soccer moms or NASCAR dads or non-college educated white men. Like, that's just like sloppy shorthand that journalists use. This is how campaigns are targeting people now. They're targeting Sarah Gomez because their voter file scores show that she has a 91.3% likelihood of listing climate as her top priority. And then, because what I said was the one thing you're not allowed to forget from this presentation, it's really easy for us to then just cross-reference those scores with people's public voting histories and isolate who are all these super environmentalists who don't vote. And again, we can literally know them by name and street address. We often have phone numbers and cell phone numbers for most of them because it's on the voter file. What you're looking at here is a map of the 2,400 already registered voters in Portland, Maine, who list climate or the environment, who have a high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority, who skipped the 2016 presidential election. Here are the 42,000 in Philadelphia. Here are the 42,000 in Phoenix, Arizona. Not to get creepy, but like we literally know them by name and street address. And this is how sophisticated political campaigns now target people. Again, I want to move on. If you have questions about any of this, we can address them in the Q&A. So that gets us to the next thing, mobilization. Once we find these people, again, we don't need to do any issue education. We don't need to persuade them to care more about climate and the environment. They're with us. And so when there's not a pandemic, we'll knock on doors, we'll do door-to-door canvassing. We're not doing that right now. but we have over 5,000 volunteers who are calling and texting these voters. We send them direct mail, we send them digital advertisements, all with behavioral science informed messaging, messages that we know from dozens of randomized control trials are proven to increase their likelihood of voting. And very quickly, before I get into the types of messages that we use, I'm going to, and please, all you social scientists, I'm going to do a really quick demonstration of what RCTs are. Obviously, it's a bit more nuanced and sophisticated than this, but very quickly, this is how we figure out not only the impact that we're having, but which messages work to boost turnout and which messages don't. We submit our work to what's called randomized control trials. What that means is, let's say we identify 1 million non-voting environmentalists in Florida. What we do not do is immediately start texting and calling and sending mail and digital ads to all 1 million of them. Instead, before talking to a single one, we randomly remove about 15 to 20% and set them aside in what's called a control group. The remaining 800,000, those are the ones we text and call and send mail and digital ads to, and we have different groups getting different messages so that we can test the efficacy of each different message. Then the election happens. And now for the third time, I'll say, remember, whether you vote or not is public record. And so it's the easiest thing to then look up after the election, how many people voted in our control group versus how many people voted in our treatment group. And then we can isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables like weather or other political campaigns or other organizations. And again, I'll just briefly touch on the messages that work. If we want to get more into the behavioral psychology and behavioral science of these messages, I'm happy to do so in the Q&A. But what we have found and what a generation of behavioral scientists, behavioral psychologists, behavioral economists have found is that what doesn't work terribly well or at all is to try to rationally convince someone of the importance of voting. We all like to think of ourselves as hyper-rational, logical people, and whenever we're deciding whether to do something, knowingly or not, like we like to think that we're making a cost-benefit analysis and almost treating it like a transaction. But that's not how we work. It's not. Instead, what the latest generation of behavioral scientists have discovered through a lot of these randomized control trials is that we're more social beings than we are rational beings. And usually when we're trying to decide whether to take an action or not, it's because we're trying to express an aspect of ourselves. We have decided the type of person we want to be, or more importantly, the type of person we want others to think we are. And our actions often try to fit in with that perception. So what do I mean by that? I mean, most of the messaging we use at the Environmental Voter Project that's most successful in turning non-voters into voters essentially tries to figure out what societal norms do our targets buy into, and how can we leverage that to get them to vote? And so one very obvious example is peer pressure. Peer pressure. We will text people with messages as simple as, hey, Sarah, did you know last time there was an election, 73 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Like total juvenile crap. But it sends turnout through the roof because peer pressure still works. We still look to our peers, our neighbors, our friends for cues as to what is and isn't socially acceptable behavior, and we want to comply with those norms. We leverage peer affinity groups and use really normative statements like real environmentalists vote, good parents vote, things like that. Many of you, if you've ever worked on a political campaign, have probably tried to get people to sign a pledge promising to vote. It's very simple, but it's deceptively simple. It relies on some very sophisticated behavioral science that's born out of this framework. The idea is, one of the stickiest societal norms we have is that all of us want to be thought of as honest people. Like, unless you're a psychopath, a sociopath, like you don't want people to think you're a liar. You don't want people to think that like you'd never keep your promises. And so one of the easiest things you can do to get someone to vote is get them to promise to vote. And then importantly, crucially importantly, follow up with them later right before the election and remind them of that promise. say, Sarah, I just want to remind you on October 7th, you made a promise to vote. And I know it's important to you to be an honest person who keeps your promises. And Tuesday's your opportunity to follow through on that promise. And we might follow up with you after the election to find out how your experience was at the polls. Is it a little heavy-handed? Yeah. But again, it sends turnout through the roof. Because now, instead of us trying to convince Sarah of the importance of her one vote in an election of millions, we're equating the act of voting with her being an honest person or not, which obviously has a significantly higher degree of power. For some very quick examples of some of the messages that we use, and I know this is like weird color and weird font, believe me, we test the you-know-what out of everything. Things like be a good voter. It's about who you are, not the importance of the action. It's about who are you? Are you a good voter or a bad voter? Who you vote for is private, whether you vote is public record. Your neighbors are voting, will you? Peer pressure. We even send direct mail to people, including copies of their personal voting history. Yeah, this rubs some people the wrong way, but I'm not on the ballot. I'm not asking them to vote for me. What I know is that this can send turnout through the roof, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 percentage points. Because we've realized another societal norm that people buy into is even if you don't vote, you usually want other people to think that you do. You want other people to think that you're a good voter. So very quickly, we've gotten great results off these. I'm not saying this to pound our chest, just to let you realize how powerful these tools are. In the 2018 midterms, our first multi-state set of campaigns, we increased turnout 2.7 percentage points over our control group. Might not sound like a lot to you guys, but ask Hillary Clinton how big a deal 2.7 is. It's a big deal in this business. That was enough for us to be solely responsible for adding 59,000 brand new environmental votes to the electorate. And by the end of that year, our second full year, we had graduated 93,000 people out of our program. That means 93,000 of these non-voting environmentalists had by that point voted in federal, state, and local elections. They were super voters. I'm going to speed to the finish here. 2019, last year, we expanded from our first 6 states. You see them there, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida, Colorado, Nevada, into 6 more states, Arizona, New Mexico, North Carolina, Virginia, New Hampshire, and Maine. These are the 12 states that we're working in now. We were active in over 600 elections last year. This is what I meant by habit reinforcement. We don't even let an odd year go by without using every election as an opportunity to turn non-voters into voters. By the end of last year, we had graduated 253,000 non-voters into super voters. 253,000, including, I might add, 51,000 in the state of Pennsylvania, a state that was decided by 44,000 votes in 2016. Now, we don't have graduate numbers for our 6 expansion states because we haven't been there long enough. We've continued to target people throughout this year, using every election as an opportunity to turn non-voters into voters. And with over 5,000 volunteers, we have already, at this moment in time, banked close to 30,000 early voters. So for a presidential election right now, by definition, if you're unlikely to vote, that means you've never voted before. So we've already banked close to 30,000 first-time environmental voters in these states. And we're really, really proud of that. And that's how powerful these techniques are. Wow, 12:45 on the nose. So now it's time for the Q&A. I realize I rushed through a whole lot of this, but I'm really, really excited to hear your questions and have a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. I think after your talk, I may consider an alternative career in politics. We have a few questions. I wanted to kick us off thinking about some of the last data combined with a previous slide. So you showed that there are about 10 million environmentalists that don't vote. And if I remember correctly, the map you showed, most of them are in blue states, assuming that these environmentalists are typically Democrats. Maybe it's not an assumption I should make. Maybe you can comment on that as well. So how likely is it that they will be changing presidential elections? Are you thinking more that they could, yes, we could work our way down and then back up? to local and then back up to
Right.
federal. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So great question. So first, that map. So first I want to be clear about a few things. 10.1 million did not vote in the 2016 presidential election. Obviously, who is a non-voter depends on the election you're looking at. So close to 13 million didn't vote in the 2018 midterms. And so the number is different depending on the election. Second, that map was a little deceptive because obviously if you map where all the environmentalists are or all the non-voting environmentalists are, it's largely going to track where all the people are, right? It's going to track population densities. And so, yes, a lot of non-voting environmentalists are in blue states, but there are also an enormous number of non-voting environmentalists in red states and purple states. So I'll give you some examples. We are targeting 600,000 non-voting environmentalists, people who list that climate or the environment as their #1 priority in Florida. Almost 200,000 in Arizona, 230,000 in Georgia. There are a lot of non-voting environmentalists in purple and even red states. Texas, we would be in Texas if we had more money. Texas, I mean, you can't you throw a ball and chances are you're going to hit a non-voting environmentalist in Texas. And so they aren't just in blue states. However, what you brought up, Sarah, is an important point. And I think it's worth stressing. Even if what I just said wasn't true, boy, is it important for us in the climate movement and in the environmental movement to not just take federal policymaking seriously, but also take state and local policymaking seriously for two reasons. One, big city mayors can save the planet. I mean, with tweaks to zoning codes and building codes and parking regulations and traffic regulations. I mean, they just have an enormous capacity to help the environment and stave off the climate crisis. And same as the state level. But two, local and state politicians are every bit as responsive to political dynamics as federal policymakers are. Like, believe me, they like winning elections too. And if anything, because in local and state elections, fewer people vote than in federal elections, well, that means showing up is even more power. I mean, you get an extra 5,000 or 10,000 environmentalists to vote in a municipal election or a state rep race or a state Senate race. I mean, you swamp the entire electorate. And so, yeah, it's really, really important that we don't just play these like power dynamics at the federal level, but also at the state and local level too.
Right. Thank you so much. There are a couple of questions about the data that define people as an environmentalist. Mm-hmm. And people were wondering how are people accessing those kind of data? I mean, how, for example, somebody mentioned the example, how do they know I drive a Volvo or that I like basketball?
Right. So great question. So first, in case anybody's wondering, I just want to be clear. 98% of the people in this business are good actors. And then there's like Cambridge Analytica, which you've probably heard of, and groups that steal data and pretend to be other people. Like, we don't do any of that. We use the same data that like the Democratic Party does and, groups like that. But you might be surprised how much data is publicly available. And I'll give you some examples. You don't need to raise your hands, but just quietly to yourself. Come on now, how many of you have actually spent the 4 hours reading every word of the iTunes download contract? Or do you just like scroll to the bottom and click, okay, I want to buy my 99-cent download? Like, of course you don't read it. Of course you don't read it. And 9 out of 10 times when you're signing any contract like that, whether it's to get a Banana Republic credit card or an iTunes download or anything like that, you are giving them the right to trade your data. It then becomes publicly available. You're giving them the right to do that. Another example, when my wife and I bought this house that I'm talking to you from, first house we bought, we went in for the closing, we signed all these documents, Went home the next day, my phone rings, 2 moving companies called me. How the hell do they know I just bought a house? Because my bank sold them our information. This data is useful. And magazine companies do it when you subscribe to magazines. A lot of nonprofits do it. We don't give people's data away, but a lot of nonprofits give that data away. And so, yeah, there's a lot of this data that's publicly traded and it's out there. And we can wish that we didn't live in a world like this. Honestly, I wish we didn't live in a world where there was all of this data out there for us. But as long as we abide by the highest ethical standards and only use data that is publicly available, you're darn right I'm going to use it. I mean, we haven't spent a lot of time or really any time talking about the existential nature of the problems we're facing in the environmental movement right now. But I'm not going to play around. If there is freely available data that people have given up, I'm going to use it to find these non-voting environmentalists and dramatically increase the political power of the environmental movement. You're darn right I am.
And along those lines about being an environmentalist, there's a question here about how do campaigns define environmentalists? Is it based on whether they care about climate change? Is it maybe they care about environmental justice? What makes them an environmentalist?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And obviously there are 1,000,001 different ways that you can define an environmentalist, and no one way is better than another. And the Environmental Voter Project's definition is just as idiosyncratic as anything else. What we do, because of the unique nature of our work, is we're not trying to find people who kind of sort of care about climate or the environment. We're trying to go after that tip of the spear, because we're trying to make the most efficient, high leverage play, just saying, who are the people who, if we just blindly turn them from non-voters into voters, are going to have the most leverage on changing environmental policymaking? And who those people are people who list climate change, clean air, clean water, clean energy, environmental justice, any environmental issue as not just important, but quite literally their #1 priority over all others. And so that's the approach we take. But again, I want to be clear, like, there are 1,000,000 different ways to define an environmentalist. Obviously, even the term environmentalist is a loaded term, which some people might not even use themselves. We don't use that term. I use it in shorthand to describe to you these type of people we're targeting. But the way we do it, the way we elicit this information, is we'll just call people and ask an open-ended question and just say, Sarah, what's your #1 most important political priority? And then it's up to us to say, oh, well, she said clean water, so that's an environmental issue. You know, we sort of tag that. But it's a great point because there's a lot of nuance here and a lot of different ways to find people who align with these value sets.
Thank you. There is another question about strategy. And George, who is the person who's asking, is wondering whether actually isn't the strategy of making a plan is working? Is it efficient? Can you talk about that?
Is making a plan efficient?
Make a plan to vote.
Got it. Yes. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you, George. It's a great question. So there are a lot of different messages that work well with different groups of people over different channels, and they all have varying levels of impact. But yes, there's been a lot of research showing that if you prompt someone to not just make a plan to vote, but either say it to you or write it down, it does increase their turnout rate, and randomized controlled trials show that. Now, from an academic sense, behavioral scientists sort of disagree as to what's going on there. Is the reason plan making increases their turnout because they're almost sort of telling themselves that they're going to do something, and then they'd be lying to themselves if they didn't? Or does it take away some of the friction of voting or something like that? But yes, there is research showing that if you get someone to say, yes, I intend to vote, oh, I'm going to vote early, or I'm going to vote on election day. Oh, yeah, my polling place is like around the corner on Main Street. Like if you get them to say this stuff, yeah, there is data showing that increases their likelihood of voting. It's not as dramatic as an increase as some other techniques that can be used, but it's also a really easy intervention. And so I would never claim not to do it. It absolutely works. Absolutely.
Thank you. And I think based on the questions I'm seeing, I would like to end based on a call for action question. So people are asking how they can volunteer, for example. And also I know you have hosted a number of our students to do internship at the Environmental Voter Project. So maybe you could talk about how can people help, and also another question is how your work is funded. So maybe that's another call for action. So please wrap up the talk by talking through a few of those things.
Sure, yeah. So I had a call to action slide that I skipped because I was so happy that I, like at 12:45 was done. So there are a few things. One, you can pledge to vote. You can go to our website, environmentalvoter.org, sign this promise to vote, and we will send you election reminders before every election, local, state, and federal. You can volunteer. Every single day, we have online training webinars where you can learn how to call and text these non-voting environmentalists for us. We provide the behavioral science informed messaging so you can turn them out. And boy, do we need a lot of volunteers. We've got 5,000, but we could use another 5,000. We've got a heavy lift over the next 26 days. Finally, be a loud and proud environmental voter, by which I mean what all of these behavioral science experiments tell us is that your social capital is maybe the most valuable thing you've got when you're trying to change other people's behavior. Whether you know it or not, a lot of your friends and family members and neighbors and peers and fellow students and fellow faculty and staff, they look to you for cues. They look to you to see, oh, what does it mean to be a good environmentalist? What is Sarah doing? What does it mean to be civically engaged? What are Alejandra and Sarah doing? They look to you to figure out what appropriate behavior is. And so don't vote in silence. Be loud and proud on social media. Let everybody know that you are a voter, because people will take that cue. And then finally, the question about our funding. We are what's called a 501c4 nonprofit. What that means is we can't get funding from most foundations. There are a few public charities that can fund us, but the lion's share of our funding comes from individual donors. So we've had, I think, 44, maybe 4,500 different donors donate to us this year, everywhere from, I think, $2 was our smallest donation, up to $200,000. We currently have a $2 million budget, but we can get up to 2.9 million over the next 26 days without having a drop off in our return on investment. And obviously we would appreciate financial help, but that's not what the focus of this is. If all of you are looking for volunteer work, we would love to train you and have you call non-voting environmentalists. But most importantly, whether you go to environmentalvoter.org to get engaged and to get involved, do everything that the folks at Jumbo Vote told you to do. Like, sign up, make sure that you're registered, and most importantly, be loud and proud about being a voter. Everybody's watching you on social media, and make sure that you set a good example.
Thank you so much. Again, this was an amazing talk like 4 years ago, and I really hope we see the impact on November 3rd. So thank you so much, Nathaniel, and hopefully we see you in another 4 years.
That would be great. Thank you, Sarah, and Colin and Sarah and Alejandra and everybody else. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. See you next week.